Hello YouTube, this is Matt Pullen, and this video concerns the Vienna game. Starts e4, e5, it's a king pawn opening, knight c3, knight f6. And we're going to be discussing 3f4, the classical definition of a Vienna game. Bishop c4 and g3 are also considered Viennas. But we're going to talk about f4. It's sort of a delayed king's gambit, if you will. If black plays passively, white will just develop his pieces in king's gambit fashion and have a small space advantage on the king side. Likewise, if black were to capture this pawn, e takes f4, it is known to be good for white, because after e5, the black knight does not have any squares to go to except for g8. For instance, queen e7, queen e2, now knight g8 is forced. And after knight f3, with the idea of knight d5 and or d4, white has an obvious advantage. So the only move really worth playing here is pawn to d5, countering and opening up in the center. After f takes e5, knight takes e4, 5 knight f3 is usually played. And here, bishop e7, quoting Grandmaster Nigel Davies from his repertoire book, Play e4, e5. Black has several other moves here, but I like Karpov's simple and economical approach. He develops a piece, prepares castling, and supports g5 square for his knight. After this move, 6 queen e2, this was seen in Kingscrusher's games, specifically as Blitz video number 53. This move in this variation and in the other black variations, I think is critical for the whole f4 lines. White puts short-term pressure on the knight on e4, trying to force black to take the knight on c3. He temporarily blocks in the bishop on f1. So it may look kind of strange to develop a queen in front of a bishop like this, but white will hopefully castle queenside, and if he doesn't, then later after this knight on e4 is gone, white will shift his queen over to f2 and then develops a bishop. For instance, in Kingscrusher Blitz 53, his opponent captures on c3, and now usually there are two ways to capture back a knight. Capturing with the b pawn is if you want to support a broad pawed center. But here, Kingscrusher captures with the d pawn, and I like this way of playing the position. Capturing with the d pawn opens more lines for white's pieces. So he emphasizes piece play as opposed to pawn structure. He has this isolated pawn, but he wants to develop bishop f4, overprotecting the pawn, and castle queenside. Perhaps later on this queen will shift to f2, g3 to activate on the king side, or this bishop will develop. Or white could just push forward c4 to try and chip away at the black center. The game continued knight c6, bishop f4, castles kingside, castles queenside. Kingscrusher's opponent played f6, trying to open the f-file, liquidate white's control over e5 and develop his pieces. But Kingscrusher played the creative pawn to e6, preventing black's position from growing, at the same time risking losing the pawn on e6. So this is how I think this should be played. Queen to e2. However, black does not have to take the knight on c3. Instead, as in the line that Davies discusses, knight g5 is an effective retreat. Now, if white were to play pawn to d4, then black can just play pawn to c6 according to Davies, and the plan is to play knight to a6, at a point where the bishop cannot capture it, and then move into the position, through c7 and e6, blockading the white pawn center. So after knight to g5, white could also take on g5, although this does not get him very much. After bishop takes, white can play, say, queen f3, putting pressure on d5. After c6, bishop e2. It's not clear what else white should do here. If he just goes ahead and gets castled, black can get castled, and then answer with f6, breaking up white's control over the e5 square. So this doesn't provide any advantage for white. So this, I find this knight g5 stuff to be particularly hard to deal with if you want to play this as your main opening for white and get an advantage. So I was thinking, why not start the search earlier? For instance, instead of knight to f3, maybe queen to e2, with the idea moving the queen to e2 a move earlier, trying to get black to commit to this capture on c3. Because here, white is threatening to take on e4. Davies says that queen e2 on this move is best met with knight to c6. Now, I'm actually not as concerned about knight to c6 as another move. But for instance, let's say knight to c6. Something that white needs to be aware of. It looks like he can win a pawn because he outnumbers black on e4. But after knight takes, black can play the intermezzo knight to d4, and now black is attacking c2 as well as the queen. After queen d3, d takes e4, black's knight is protected, and queen takes e4, bishop f5, black will take on c2 and gain the advantage. So the knight f3 is usually played because the white cannot take on e4. And here, black, if he takes on c3, will lead back into the kingscrusher style position after, say, bishop e7, bishop f4. Or black can maintain the tension with bishop f5. Now, there are several moves that get played here. One of them is queen to b5, justifying the black bishop move by attacking two undefended pawns, b7 and d5. However, is kind of troubling to play this as your primary opening when you need to justify it with a pawn grab like this. After pawn to a6, either pawn, if white grabs it, black will answer with the knight to b4, and black will gain the advantage. Some people like to play knight to d1 to avoid exchanges, and kick this knight away without allowing a trade on c3. But here, I think maybe the most plausible way for white to play is to play pawn to d3. After takes, white doesn't have the desirable take away from the center that he usually does. After b takes c3, however, because black has this knight blockading, he can't easily play c6, queen c7 to guard his b pawn. So I think maybe white makes use of the half-open b file and pawn mass in the center. So, for instance, one game I like followed d4, rook b1, bishop c5, queen f2, pinning, queen e7, and then rook b5. This doesn't get played a lot, but I think is a plausible way for white to play, and I'm surprised it's not seen more often. However, the real problem, I think, with this line of play, as opposed to knight c6, is queen h4 check. Now here, g3 is forced, and knight takes g3, making use of the pin on the h2 pawn. Knight f3 loses a pawn for white after knight takes, knight takes c3. So instead, queen f2 must be played. Now black just retreats, knight f5. Knight takes d5 here is clearly bad for white, after queen e4 check, threatening to take the knight on d5. And so white has to block knight e3. And now, as opposed to grabbing the rook on h1, black just has the simple knight takes, pawn takes, knight c6, and white has nothing to show for the fractured pawns. So, after queen h4 check, g3, knight takes g3, queen f2, knight f5, white can exchange queens, but he doesn't get very much in this queenless middle game. Knight a6 is a perfectly reasonable defense. with the idea of kicking the knight away, castling, and bringing the pieces out, making use of the f5 square. Bishop takes a6 gets refuted after knight takes check, king d7, knight takes a8, bishop b7, winning back the material with interest. So yeah, I don't really have an answer for that. I mean, I'd like to think that you could cut back on some of black's options, like the knight g5 option, by playing queen e2 on this move. However, it's not knight c6 that concerns me, but is the queen h4, in which case, maybe the best white can do is a queenless middle game with a very small advantage. Anyway, these have been some of my thoughts on the Vienna game with 3f4. I hope you enjoyed and got something out of this. Talk to you next time, YouTube.